There comes a quiet moment in a person's life when the noise finally dies down, not because the world has become kinder, but because the soul has learned to listen past the chaos. It is in that silence that truth begins to speak. You may remember the season when hands reached for you with hidden motives, when words were wrapped in sweetness but carried thorns underneath. You did not ask for the conflict. You did not invite the betrayal. You were simply present, honest, and real in a world that often punishes sincerity, and yet somehow you became the target. What they did not understand then, and what they are beginning to understand now, is that touching an innocent life leaves fingerprints on one's own destiny. There is a strange law woven into existence, older than human courts and more precise than any scale of justice. It does not rush, it does not shout, it waits. While you were learning endurance, this law was taking notes. While you were choosing silence over revenge, it was recording every intention, every whispered plan, every deliberate wound. People assume consequences arrive with thunder and spectacle, but more often they come quietly, like a crack forming beneath a foundation no one thought could break. You walked away carrying scars. They stayed behind carrying seeds they planted with their own hands. At first it seemed unfair. You questioned why those who caused the harm appeared untouched, even thriving. You wondered whether goodness had any real weight in a world that rewards cunning and cruelty. But time has a way of revealing what haste conceals. What you could not see then was the slow turning of the wheel. While you were healing, they were hardening. While you were shedding illusions, they were building lives on them. And now the very structures they trusted are beginning to tremble under the truth they tried to bury. There is a peculiar discomfort that comes when people realize too late that they misjudged the quiet one. They mistook your restraint for weakness, your patience for permission, your kindness for ignorance. They believed you would always be there to absorb the damage, to smooth over the mess, to carry what they refused to face. What they did not consider is that stepping away is sometimes the most powerful act of all. When you left, you took more than your presence. You took the cover that protected them from themselves. Now, consequences are unfolding, not as punishment delivered by your hand, but as lessons delivered by life itself. Confusion replaces confidence. Restlessness replaces peace. Relationships fracture under the same behaviors once aimed at you. They begin to experience the weight of their own actions, not because you wished it upon them, but because reality finally caught up. It is unsettling to realize that the harm one sends outward has a way of returning inward, altered only in timing, never in truth. You may notice how often your name enters their thoughts now, not with triumph, but with regret. They replay moments, conversations, choices. They wonder how different things might have been had they chosen honesty over manipulation, respect over control. There is a particular ache that comes from knowing you harmed someone who never intended to harm you back. It lingers because there is no easy remedy for it. Apologies come too late when the damage has already rewritten the story. And yet, while all this unfolds, you are not required to watch, nor to celebrate, nor to participate. Your role was never to enforce justice. Your task was survival, growth, and truth. The balance being restored has nothing to do with your anger or your forgiveness. It has everything to do with alignment. When you chose to step out of the pattern, you aligned yourself with something higher than revenge. You chose freedom. They chose repetition. And repetition, sooner or later, reveals its cost. There is a sobering realization that dawns on those who cause harm without conscience. The world does not forget, even when people do. The echoes of what they did follow them into rooms you will never enter again. The peace you are slowly rebuilding is the very peace they can no longer access. This is not cruelty. It is consequence. It is the natural result of sowing disorder into the lives of others and expecting order in return. So, if there is a thought that passes quietly through your mind now, let it be this. Leaving was not loss. Silence was not weakness. Endurance was not foolishness. Everyone involved is meeting the truth of who they were when they thought no one was watching. And somewhere deep within them is a wish they cannot undo, that they had left you alone and spared themselves the lesson they are now forced to learn. You became a target not because you carried malice, deception, or weakness, but because sincerity has a way of unsettling those who survive by masks. There is something deeply uncomfortable about standing near a person who does not need to pretend. Such a presence acts like an unspoken mirror. Without accusation, without effort, it reflects what others work tirelessly to hide. You did not expose anyone by speaking loudly or pointing fingers. Your very way of being did the work. Integrity, when lived quietly, has a strange authority. It questions without words. It challenges without confrontation. And for those who build their sense of control on illusion, that kind of presence feels dangerous. People often believe harm is directed at those who provoke it, but reality is more subtle and more unsettling. Harm is often aimed at those who remind others of what they abandoned. Your honesty stirred old discomforts. Your boo, endearies interrupted familiar patterns. Your refusal to participate in falsehood disrupted a system that depended on your silence or compliance. They did not wake up one day intending to wound you. They simply reacted the way insecurity always does when it feels threatened, by striking first, by diminishing what it cannot dominate, by attempting to silence what it cannot corrupt. What makes sincerity so powerful is not its loudness, but its steadiness. You remained consistent when inconsistency would have been easier. You chose clarity when confusion would have protected you. That steadiness made it impossible for them to rationalize their behavior without discomfort. And discomfort, when resisted, turns into resentment. Instead of facing themselves, they turned their attention toward you. It felt simpler to label you as the problem than to question the foundations of their own conduct. There is also a peculiar cruelty reserved for those who do not play the expected roles. When someone refuses to respond with bitterness, refuses to retaliate, refuses to bend their values for acceptance, it unsettles social agreements that thrive on compromise of conscience. You were not supposed to stay kind and firm at the same time. You were not supposed to remain calm without surrendering. That contradiction confused them, and confusion left unchecked often becomes hostility. What they fail to understand is that being targeted does not always indicate vulnerability. Sometimes it signals proximity to truth. History quietly confirms this pattern again and again. Those who stand without duplicity attract pressure not because they are weak, but because they are unmanageable. You could not be easily manipulated, guilted, or controlled without exposure. Your presence demanded honesty, and honesty is costly for those who have lived cheaply with truth. You may have questioned yourself in those moments. You may have wondered whether being softer, quieter, or less visible would have spared you the pain. That doubt is understandable but misplaced. Dimming integrity does not buy safety. It only postpones conflict with oneself. The discomfort you felt was not proof of failure, but evidence of alignment. You stood in a place that required courage, even when courage went unnoticed. In time, it becomes clear that being targeted was never about your flaws. It was about your difference. It was about the way your existence disrupted narratives they depended on to feel justified. And though the experience wounded you, it also confirmed something quietly profound. Truth does not need permission to stand, and sincerity does not require defense. It simply exists. And that alone is enough to shake what was built on pretense. There exists a law deeper than reputation and older than human memory, one that does not announce itself and cannot be negotiated away. It observes not merely what is done, but why it is done. While people measure life by visible outcomes, success, applause, influence, this law records intentions with unsettling precision. It listens to whispers spoken in secret, weighs motives hidden beneath smiles, and takes note of choices made when no witness seems present. Nothing is rushed, nothing is overlooked. It waits because it can afford to. This law does not behave like human justice, which is often impatient and flawed. Human systems are loud, reactive, and selective. They depend on evidence, persuasion, and timing. This deeper order requires none of that. It does not need exposure to function. It does not need public acknowledgement to operate. It works quietly, embedding consequences into the very structure of a person's path. What is planted inwardly eventually shapes outward reality, not as punishment, but as alignment, one of the greatest illusi. People carry is the belief that unobserved actions vanish. They assume secrecy equals safety, that time dissolves guilt, that cleverness outruns consequence. But intention leaves a residue. Every act done in malice subtly reshapes the inner landscape of the one who commits it. Patterns form, perceptions distort, justifications multiply. Over time, these internal shifts begin to affect relationships, decisions, and outcomes. Life responds not to appearances, but to direction. While you were enduring confusion and restraint, this law was active, though invisible. It was not tallying scores in a ledger of revenge. It was simply allowing each person to move further into the consequences of their chosen posture toward truth. You chose endurance, reflection, and distance from corruption. That choice began shaping clarity even before relief arrived. They chose manipulation, dismissal, and harm. That choice began shaping instability even while things appeared intact. What makes this law so unsettling is its patience. It allows people enough time to believe they have escaped it. That belief often becomes their undoing. Confidence turns careless. Patterns intensify. The same behaviors that once succeeded are repeated more boldly, without caution, and repetition is revealing. Eventually, the structure collapses not because of a single event, but because it was never sound to begin with. This is why consequences often appear unrelated to the original harm. People expect a direct exchange, an obvious reversal. Instead, life responds more creatively. Opportunities narrow, trust erodes. Relationships mirror the same coldness once extended outward. Inner unrest becomes constant. These outcomes feel unfair only when one forgets the seeds that produced them. The law does not explain itself, it demonstrates. You were not spared difficulty because you were innocent. Innocence does not exempt anyone from pain, but intention does influence trajectory. While suffering shaped you inwardly toward awareness, it shaped others toward fragmentation. That difference grows over time. Paths diverge. What once looked equal no longer is. One path slowly stabilizes, the other grows increasingly unstable, though its origin remains unseen by those walking it. The most sobering realization about this law is that it cannot be escaped by apology alone, nor delayed by denial. It is not interested in guilt or self-pity. It responds to transformation. Until intention changes, outcome repeats. This is why regret, when unaccompanied by reflection, offers no relief. Life continues to echo what has not been understood. And so, while you questioned silence and wondered whether truth mattered, this deeper order was already responding, not dramatically, not publicly, but faithfully, recording, aligning, waiting. While you were learning how to breathe through the weight of what was done to you, something unseen was already in motion. Pain has a way of slowing time for the one who carries it. Days stretch, nights grow longer, questions repeat themselves without answers. In that season, it may have felt as though nothing was happening beyond your own endurance. Yet endurance is never empty. It is not passive. It is a quiet form of participation in a process far larger than immediate relief. While you were choosing not to harden, not to retaliate, not to become what hurt you, the groundwork for consequence was being laid elsewhere. There is a misconception that consequences must arrive quickly to be real. People often believe that if accountability does not appear immediately, it will never come at all. But delay is not denial. Delay is precision. Immediate consequences teach fear. Delayed consequences teach understanding. While you were wrestling inwardly with confusion and restraint, those who harmed you were being given time to repeat themselves, time to deepen patterns, time to prove whether the harm was an accident or a reflection of character. Time, in this sense, was not mercy for them alone. It was evidence being allowed to mature. Your silence was not emptiness. It was restraint under pressure, and restraint always clarifies direction. Every moment you chose not to respond in kind refined something within you. You learned discernment instead of suspicion. You learned distance instead of bitterness. You learned to observe rather than explain yourself to people who had already decided not to understand. These internal shifts may not have felt like progress, but they were movement of the deepest kind. They were shaping how life would later meet you. At the same time, elsewhere, patterns were consolidating. When harmful behavior goes unchecked by reflection, it grows bolder. What begins as a small justification becomes a habit. What becomes a habit turns into identity. Those who hurt you were not standing still while you healed, they were practicing who they were becoming. Each repeated action narrowed their options. Each rationalization reinforced a way of seeing the world that would eventually work against them. The imbalance you sensed, the feeling that you were suffering while they appeared untouched, was temporary, though it felt endless at the time. Suffering often arrives early for those who are forced to wake up. Consequences often arrive later for those who refuse to. You were processing reality in real time. They were postponing it. And postponed truth does not disappear, it accumulates. There is also a hidden cost to being spared immediate consequence. It creates a false sense of immunity. When nothing happens at first, people assume they are exempt from consequence altogether. That assumption feeds carelessness. Carols. SNES invites exposure. Over time, the very freedom they thought they gained by harming you became the space in which their actions could multiply without restraint. What felt like escape was actually expansion of habits, of damage, of eventual collapse. Your pain, though heavy, was finite. It was doing work within you. It was forcing growth, awareness, and separation from what could not follow you forward. Their delay was not kindness, it was accumulation, and accumulation always demands payment. While you were learning to carry weight with integrity, the weight on their side was increasing unnoticed. That difference matters. It always does. What looked like their success was convincing enough to make you doubt yourself. Appearances often are. From a distance, it seemed as though they moved on easily, perhaps even prospered. Smiles returned to their faces. Their lives appeared intact. In contrast, you were left with questions, emotional debris, and the slow work of rebuilding. It is natural in such moments to mistake visibility for truth. Yet visibility is only surface. Success without integrity is not stability, it is delay wearing a costume. There is a dangerous comfort in early advantage. When harmful behavior produces immediate results, control, attention, escape, it teaches the wrong lesson. It tells the person that the method works. It encourages repetition. What they called success was not proof of wisdom, it was proof that consequences had not yet matured. The absence of immediate fallout often strengthens the very behaviors that will later undo someone completely. True stability requires coherence between inner life and outward action. What you saw was outward motion unsupported by inward alignment. Such motion can be fast, impressive, even admired, but it lacks endurance. You may not have had the language for it then, but what you sensed as unease was your intuition, recognizing a structure built without foundation. It stands for a while, sometimes longer than expected, but it does not stand forever. Meanwhile, your own life felt paused. Healing rarely looks productive. It strips rather than adds. It dismantles false narratives and forces honesty where comfort once lived. In a culture that celebrates speed and display, this kind of inward work looks like stagnation. Yet it is precisely this unseen labor that produces lasting strength. While their lives expanded outward, yours was being rebuilt inward. One grows loud and fragile, the other grows quiet and resilient. The danger of confusing delay with exemption is that it invites comparison. You may have wondered why integrity seemed to cost you so much, while duplicity appeared to reward them. That comparison is understandable, but it is based on incomplete timelines. Lives cannot be measured by moments. The true measure is sustainability. What can endure pressure? What can survive exposure? What remains intact when novelty fades and scrutiny arrives? What you witnessed as their success required constant maintenance. Image must be managed. Stories must be adjusted. Relationships must be controlled. This kind of life demands vigilance because it is always one discovery away from collapse. The peace you lacked then was not stolen, it was postponed until it could be real. The peace they displayed was not earned, it was borrowed against a future cost. There is also a quiet irony in delayed consequence. It allows success to grow large enough to fall hard. Small collapses teach little. Large ones expose everything. By the time the unraveling begins, there is more to lose, more eyes watching, more inner emptiness revealed. What once looked like winning becomes the very stage on which loss is displayed. You were spared that spectacle. Your losses happened privately. Your rebuilding was unseen. That difference protects you. It means your growth was not performative. It means your values were refined without an audience. And when stability returns, it will not require defense or explanation. It will simply be. What appeared to be their advantage was never proof that they escaped consequence. It was evidence that the process was still unfolding. Delay gave them room to believe a lie. Reality will correct it, not with cruelty, but with accuracy. Time has a way of revealing what urgency hides. In the beginning, everything feels blurred. Intentions, motives, outcomes. People rush to explain, defend, rewrite events while emotions are still raw. In that chaos, truth rarely stands clearly. It waits. It does not compete with noise. It allows confusion to exhaust itself. What you experienced was not the absence of clarity, but the slow preparation for it. The unraveling you could not yet see was already underway, woven into time itself. Unraveling is rarely dramatic at first. It does not announce its arrival. It begins subtly, through small inconsistencies, minor tensions, quiet discomforts that are easy to dismiss. A relationship feels strained without explanation. A sense of satisfaction fades without reason. What once worked effortlessly now requires force. These are not random misfortunes, they are signals. Time strips away momentum and leaves only substance. Whatever was built on performance begins to tremble when performance is no longer enough. You may remember moments when you wished for immediate exposure, a clear reversal, something visible that would validate your pain. That desire is human. But immediate revelation often produces shallow understanding. Slow revelation, on the other hand, leaves no room for denial. As time passes, stories must remain consistent to survive. Masks must hold their shape. Intentions must align with outcomes. When they do not, time applies pressure, not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly. This pressure reveals patterns. What once seemed like isolated incidents begin to form a narrative. What was excused as circumstance starts to look like character. People who once defended harmful behavior grow tired of making excuses. The same conflicts appear in new settings with different faces. Time repeats lessons until they are acknowledged. It does not shame, it demonstrates. And demonstration is difficult to argue with. While this unraveling occurs externally, something else happens internally. The person who caused harm often becomes restless. There is a growing sense that something is wrong, though they may not know what. Peace becomes difficult to access. Silence feels uncomfortable. Distractions multiply because stillness invites memory. Time has a way of bringing unresolved truth to the surface, especially when the mind has fewer places left to hide. Meanwhile, your own clarity grows almost unnoticed. What once confused you now makes sense. You stop replaying events obsessively because their meaning becomes clear without effort. Time aligns memory with understanding. You no longer need answers from others because your perception has matured. This is the quiet gift of waiting. It replaces speculation with certainty. You see not only what happened, but why it could not have ended any other way. Unraveling does not always end in visible collapse. Sometimes it ends in quiet limitation. Opportunities narrow. Trust becomes difficult to establish. Relationships lack depth. Life feels smaller than it should. These outcomes may not look like justice from the outside, but they are accurate reflections of inward disorder. Time does not aim for spectacle. It aims for correspondence between inner reality and outer experience. You were not delayed because you were forgotten. You were delayed because understanding takes time, and truth prefers to arrive whole rather than hurried. What unfolds slowly tends to stay revealed, and once revealed, it cannot be unseen. Restraint is often misunderstood because it looks unimpressive from the outside. It lacks drama. It does not announce strength. In moments of conflict, restraint appears passive, even submissive, to those who equate power with reaction. You experience this misjudgment firsthand. Your decision not to lash out, not to escalate, not to mirror the harm done to you was interpreted as weakness. But restraint is not the absence of strength, it is strength under command. True weakness reacts impulsively because it cannot tolerate discomfort. True weakness seeks immediate relief, even if that relief creates long-term damage. Restraint, by contrast, tolerates tension. It holds space for discomfort without allowing it to dictate behavior. That capacity unsettles people who depend on provocation to maintain control. When you did not respond as expected, you disrupted a familiar script. They did not know how to proceed because their strategy required your participation. Self-mastery is quiet. It does not need witnesses. It operates internally, where decisions are made before actions ever appear. You were mastering yourself in moments no one applauded. You were choosing coherence over chaos, dignity over discharge. That choice was not obvious to those watching from the outside, but it was decisive. It shifted the entire trajectory of the situation, even though the shift was invisible at first. Those who misread restraint often assume it comes from fear. They believe silence means submission, that patience indicates inability. This belief comforts them because it reinforces a sense of dominance. But restraint rooted in awareness is not afraid. It is deliberate. It recognizes that some battles do not require engagement, that some conflicts resolve themselves when deprived of fuel. Your refusal to engage was not avoidance, it was discernment. There is also a moral clarity in restraint that threatens those who lack it. When someone chooses not to retaliate, it removes excuses. It eliminates the illusion of mutual fault. Without your reaction, their action stood alone, exposed by contrast. That exposure made them uncomfortable. It forced them to sit with their behavior without distraction. And discomfort, when resisted, often leads to escalation, which only reveals more. You may have felt pressure to defend yourself, to prove your side, to explain your silence. That pressure often comes from environments that confuse noise with truth. But truth does not require constant reinforcement. It holds its shape without explanation. Your restraint allowed time and reality to speak on your behalf. It trusted a process larger than immediate validation. Self-mastery also protects the future. Every reaction becomes a pattern. Every pattern shapes identity. By refusing to react impulsively, you preserve parts of yourself that could not survive in a reactive state. You remain someone you could recognize later. That continuity matters. It is the difference between healing and merely surviving. Those who mistook your restraint for weakness eventually encounter its consequence. They must face life without provoking a response that distracts from their own behavior. Without resistance to push against, their actions collapse inward. What once felt powerful now feels empty, and the strength they dismissed becomes the standard they can no longer meet. Your restraint was not wasted. It was invested in clarity, in alignment, in a future that does not require explanation. Walking away is often misunderstood as surrender, but in truth, it is one of the most disruptive acts a person can commit. You remained present. You unknowingly served as a stabilizing force. Your patience absorbed chaos. Your willingness to understand softened consequences that should have arrived sooner. Your presence gave others room to avoid accountability, because as long as you stayed, the focus could remain on you, your reactions, your tolerance, your endurance. When you stepped away, that buffer disappeared, and what remained was them, face to face with themselves. People rarely recognize how much protection they receive from someone who chooses restraint. Your silence prevented escalation. Your empathy delayed exposure. Your willingness to carry more than your share of responsibility kept fractures from becoming visible. Without realizing it, you were holding together a structure that was already unstable. The moment you left, the weight shifted, the balance changed, and the cracks that had been forming quietly were no longer held in place. This is why departure often triggers panic rather than relief. Losing access to you meant losing a familiar outlet, a predictable response, a person who could be counted on to soften reality. They may have told themselves they wanted you gone, but what they truly wanted was control without consequence. Your absence removed that illusion. Suddenly there was no one left to blame, no one left to absorb the impact of their decisions. The mirror could no longer be avoided. What followed was not immediate collapse, but exposure. Without your presence, patterns became obvious. Behaviors repeated without interruption. Conflicts emerged in new relationships with alarming familiarity. The same dynamics resurfaced, stripped of the narrative that once framed you as the cause. This repetition is deeply unsettling because it forces recognition. When the same outcomes occur again and again, denial loses credibility. You did not leave to punish, you left to survive. Yet survival itself can feel like judgment to those who depended on your endurance. By choosing distance, you allowed truth to operate without interference. You allowed life to respond directly to them without your mediation. This is what makes walking away so powerful. It removes the human shield that stood between someone and the consequences of their own behavior. There is also an internal reckoning that follows your absence. Silence becomes louder when there is no one left to distract from it. Memories surface uninvited. Conversations replay themselves without the comfort of justification. Regret does not arrive as a dramatic realization. It creeps in slowly through unease, restlessness, and a sense of loss that cannot be named without honesty. They begin to understand, not all at once, but gradually, what your presence prevented them from having to confront. Your absence also disrupts narratives. As long as you were there, stories could be shaped around your role. Once you were gone, those stories lost coherence. Others began to notice inconsistencies. Explanations felt incomplete. The image they worked to maintain required your participation, and without it, the performance faltered. You were no longer there to confirm their version of events by reacting to it. Walking away did not make you invisible. It made your impact clearer. The space you left behind revealed what had been filling it all along, and in that empty space, accountability had room to enter. Revenge is loud, reactive, and fleeting. It demands immediate satisfaction and promises closure, but rarely delivers it. Reality operates differently. It does not rush to soothe wounded pride or justify pain. It responds in its own time, through systems far more intricate than personal retaliation. What you witnessed was not justice administered by human hands, but consequence emerging natural. Why from behavior? This distinction matters because it explains why the outcome did not require your participation. Reality does not need anger to function. It does not require intention to punish. It simply aligns outcomes with patterns. When people live in ways that distort truth, reality adjusts around them until their environment reflects that distortion. Relationships become strained, trust erodes, stability weakens. These changes are not dramatic acts of revenge. They are natural responses to misalignment. Reality does not accuse, it reflects. Revenge seeks to restore balance by force. Reality restores balance by exposure. When someone chooses harm, manipulation, or deceit, they introduce disorder into their own lives, whether they realize it or not. That disorder may not surface immediately, but it embeds itself in decisions, perceptions, and interactions. Over time, it shapes the world they inhabit. What feels like misfortune later is often the echo of earlier choices returning in a different form. This is why the unfolding you observed felt impersonal. It did not center you. It did not validate your pain in obvious ways. Instead, it followed its own logic. The outcomes were not tailored to your story. They were consistent with theirs. That consistency is what gives reality its authority. It does not act out of emotion. It acts out of coherence, and coherence cannot be negotiated with excuses. You may have felt moments of temptation to intervene, to warn, to explain, to demand acknowledgement. But reality works best without interference. Human involvement often muddies clarity. Emotions complicate perception. When you step back, you allowed cause and effect to meet directly. There was no distortion, no mediator, no scapegoat, just action meeting consequence. This process also protects you. Revenge binds people to the very harm they wish to escape. It keeps AT&T, ancient, fixed on the past, tethered to the offender. Reality, by contrast, frees you. It moves forward regardless of personal vendettas. While outcomes unfolded for them, your life continued to reorganize around growth, understanding, and distance from chaos. You were not trapped in the cycle of retaliation. You were released from it. What makes reality's response so unsettling is its inevitability. There is no appeal process. No argument alters it. People may rage against circumstances, blame others, or deny responsibility, but reality remains unchanged. It waits until resistance exhausts itself. Only then does understanding become possible, if it becomes possible at all. The outcomes they face now are not messages sent by you. They are messages sent by life, translated into experience. And because they come from reality itself, they cannot be dismissed as personal bias or ill intent. They stand on their own, quiet, accurate, unavoidable. You did not need revenge because reality was already responding. And reality, unlike anger, does not miss. There is a strange and sobering symmetry in how patterns repeat themselves. What a person practices outwardly does not remain outward for long. It eventually turns inward. The behaviors once used against you, dismissal, manipulation, indifference, control, did not disappear when you left. They had already become habits, and habits do not require a specific target to continue. They only require opportunity. When you were no longer there to absorb their effects, those same behaviors began to circulate within their own lives, reshaping everything they touched. At first, the repetition was subtle, a familiar tension in a new relationship, a misunderstanding that felt oddly similar to past conflicts, a reaction that escalated faster than expected. These moments were easy to dismiss as coincidence, but repetition has a way of insisting on recognition. When the same outcomes occur in different settings, the common factor becomes difficult to ignore. The very traits that once gave them a sense of control now began to isolate them. What once felt strategic now felt compulsive. Manipulation requires constant adjustment, it cannot rest. Control demands vigilance, it cannot trust. Dismissal erodes connection, it cannot sustain intimacy. These behaviors, when turned inward toward one's own life, become exhausting. The energy required to maintain them grows heavier with time. And without someone like you to soften the impact, the weight lands fully where it belongs. There is also a cruel irony in this reversal. The traits they once used to gain advantage now create resistance. People grow cautious. Trust becomes conditional. Opportunities close quietly, not with confrontation, but with distance. What once seemed like strength begins to look like instability. And instability repels what it most desires: ease, cooperation, peace. This dismantling does not happen all at once. It happens through accumulation, small losses, missed connections, conversations that no longer flow, invitations that stop coming. Each loss feels minor in isolation, but together they form a pattern of contraction. Life becomes smaller, tighter, more restricted. The world responds to behavior with remarkable consistency, even when individuals refuse to see the connection. You may notice how often conflict now follows them, how similar the stories sound despite changing circumstances. This is not bad luck. It is continuity. Behavior shapes environment. When the same behavior persists, the environment reflects it back repeatedly. What they once directed outward now circles back, not as punishment, but as consequence. Meanwhile, your own life begins to reflect a different pattern. Distance from those behaviors allows clarity to grow. Interactions feel cleaner. Conflict loses its grip. The contrast becomes obvious, even if unspoken. Where chaos once followed you, it no longer does. That absence is not accidental. It is the result of removing yourself from a cycle that depended on your participation. The dismantling they experience is not dramatic enough to satisfy a desire for spectacle, but it is thorough. It affects confidence, decision-making, and self-perception. The world feels less cooperative. Progress requires more effort. Nothing quite fits the way it used to. This quiet erosion is often more effective than sudden collapse, because it leaves no moment to blame. Only a gradual recognition that something is wrong. What they are facing now is not your doing. It is the continuation of themselves uninterrupted, and that is often the most difficult consequence of all. There is a particular weight that comes with realizing, too late, that harm was inflicted on someone who never intended harm in return. It is not the sharp sting of guilt that fades with apology. It is a slow, persistent ache, one that settles into memory and resists dismissal. Regret of this kind is not loud. It does not announce itself with confession or tears. It arrives quietly, in moments of stillness, when distraction fails and honesty presses in. At first, the mind searches for relief. It revisits old justifications, rehearses explanations, reframes intentions. But these strategies lose power when faced with the simplicity of the truth. The harm was unnecessary. You were not an enemy. You were not a threat. You were simply present and available and real. That realization dismantles defenses because it removes the illusion of mutual fault. There is no balance to hide behind. Only imbalance remains. Regret intensifies when memory gains clarity. Moments once overlooked now return with sharper detail. The patience you showed, the chances you gave, the restraint you practiced. These memories acquire new meaning in hindsight. What once felt insignificant now stands out as evidence of what was lost. Regret grows not because of what was taken from you, but because of what could have been preserved had different choices been made. This form of regret is difficult to share. Admitting it requires humility, and humility threatens the very identity built around being right, being in control, being justified. So it often remains unspoken. Instead, It manifests as restlessness, irritability, or withdrawal. The body carries what the mind refuses to acknowledge. Peace becomes elusive because peace requires reconciliation with truth. There is also a haunting aspect to this regret. It cannot be undone. Apologies offered late may ease conscience, but cannot restore access. Time closes doors quietly, without ceremony. When people realize this, regret deepens. It is one thing to know you were wrong. It is another to know you no longer have the opportunity to make it right. That finality gives regret its weight. You, meanwhile, are no longer participating in the story. Your absence forces memory to stand on its own, without interruption or reinterpretation. They cannot test alternate versions of events against your reactions. They cannot provoke reassurance or conflict. What remains is a static past and a dynamic present that no longer includes you. This contrast sharpens awareness. Regret also brings comparison. They may encounter others who resemble you in small ways, your patience, your steadiness, your refusal to manipulate. These encounters reopen the wound, not because replacements fail, but because they remind. You become a reference point, not in longing, but in recognition. The mind measures what is against what was, and finds the difference unsettling. This regret does not redeem by itself, it only instructs. Whether the instruction is received depends on willingness to face truth without defense. Some do, many do not. But the presence of regret itself is proof of understanding, however incomplete. It signals that something real was damaged. You are not responsible for that realization. You did not demand it. You did not design it. It arose because truth has a way of resurfacing when pretense can no longer sustain itself. And once regret takes root, it changes how a person sees their past, even if it never changes their future. Your absence did something no argument ever could. It removed noise. It ended distraction. It took away the familiar exchange that allowed responsibility to be endlessly redirected. When you were present, there was always movement, conversation, reaction, tension, explanation. That movement created the illusion of progress while quietly preventing accountability. Once you were gone, the motion stopped, and in that stillness, reality became unavoidable. People often underestimate how much their sense of self depends on interaction. As long as you were there, they could define themselves against you, strong because you were patient, right because you were silent, justified because you did not retaliate. Your presence gave them contrast. It allowed them to avoid looking inward by keeping their attention outward. When you left, that contrast vanished. There was no longer anyone to absorb blame or soften the truth. What remained was an unfiltered encounter with their own behavior. Accountability rarely arrives as a dramatic revelation. More often, it comes as an accumulation of small moments that feel oddly familiar and increasingly uncomfortable. A conflict arises and there is no one to deflect it onto. A relationship strains and there is no easy explanation. The same complaints surface from different people. These moments force a reckoning, not because they accuse, but because they repeat. Repetition is relentless. It demands recognition. Your absence also altered how others perceive the situation. Stories that once sounded convincing lost credibility without your reactions to support them. Silence in this case spoke louder than defense ever could. Without your participation, narratives began to feel incomplete. People noticed gaps. Inconsistencies surfaced. The version of events that depended on your supposed faults no longer held together without your presence to react against it. Internally, this shift is even more pronounced. When there is no one left to respond to, provoke, or manage, the mind turns inward by necessity. Thoughts once avoided begin to surface. Memories replay themselves without the comfort of immediate rebuttal. Questions emerge that have no easy answers. This is where accountability begins, not in confession, but in confrontation with oneself. There is also a loss that accompanies this realization. It is not always the loss of you as a person, but the loss of what her presence provided: stability, familiarity, a buffer against consequence. Recognizing that this buffer is gone creates anxiety. It reveals how much was taken for granted, and it introduces a new awareness that choices have costs beyond the moment they are made. You did not need to explain why you left for accountability to take shape. Explanation often invites debate. Absence invites reflection. Your silence was not empty, it was decisive. It forced a pause long enough for truth to surface without interference. That pause is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Growth does not begin in comfort, it begins in honesty. What makes this form of accountability so powerful is that it is self-generated. No accusation can be dismissed as bias, no critique can be framed as attack. The realization arises internally, where defenses are weakest, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. Even if resisted, it lingers. Your role in this process ended the moment you chose distance. What followed was not something you orchestrated, but something you allowed. By stepping away, you gave reality room to operate without distortion. And reality, when given space, is precise. Healing does not begin with comfort, it begins with disillusionment. For you, healing required the painful dismantling of beliefs you once held about fairness, reciprocity, and how people respond to kindness. You were forced to let go of the idea that sincerity guarantees safety, or that patience will always be honored. This loss of illusion hurt, but it also clarified. It stripped away expectations that kept you bound to situations that could never truly support you. Letting go of illusion is an act of courage, because illusion often feels like hope. It tells us that if we endure a little longer, explain a little better, or love a little harder, things will change. Healing demanded that you see what was actually happening, not what you wished was happening. That clarity was costly. It required you to grieve not only what occurred, but what you believed could have been. They, on the other hand, clung to illusion as protection. Illusion allowed them to maintain a version of themselves untouched by responsibility. It reframed harm as misunderstanding, intention as accident, pattern as coincidence. Illusion preserved comfort by avoiding scrutiny. And because illusion feels easier than transformation, it is often defended fiercely. This divergence created two very different paths. Your path narrowed at first. Clarity limits options because it removes false ones. You could no longer participate in denial, excuse behavior, or minimize your own experience. That narrowing felt like loss, but it was also purification. It removed distractions and revealed what mattered: alignment, integrity, peace. Their path, sustained by illusion, appeared wider. There were more justifications, more explanations, more ways to avoid discomfort. But this apparent freedom was deceptive. Illusion requires constant maintenance. Stories must be adjusted, memories must be revised, contradictions must be ignored. Over time, this effort becomes exhausting. The mind grows crowded with inconsistencies. Peace becomes difficult to access because it depends on coherence. Healing integrates experience. It does not erase pain, but it gives pain meaning. As you released illusion, your memories reorganized themselves. Events began to make sense without forcing them to. You no longer needed validation to trust your perception. That trust is foundational. It allows the nervous system to settle. It allows the future to be approached without fear of repeating the past. Clinging to illusion does the opposite. It fragments experience. Past and present remain disconnected. Lessons repeat because they are never fully acknowledged. The essay. Situations reappear with different faces, carrying the same emotional charge. This repetition is not fate, it is avoidance made visible. What you gained through healing was not superiority, but freedom. Freedom from reinterpreting harm to preserve connection. Freedom from hoping someone would become what they consistently refuse to be. Freedom from needing resolution from those incapable of offering it. This freedom does not arrive loudly, it arrives as relief. The contrast between healing and illusion grows sharper over time. Healing simplifies, illusion complicates, healing stabilizes, illusion destabilizes. Healing allows rest, illusion requires vigilance. And though illusion may look comfortable from the outside, it is fragile. It collapses under pressure because it is unsupported by truth. You did not heal because you were stronger. You healed because you were willing to see. That willingness changed everything. Peace is not something that can be borrowed, performed, or pretended into existence. It grows only where inner life and outward behavior agree with each other. This is why peace follows integrity so faithfully, and why chaos trails manipulation wherever it goes. Integrity simplifies the soul. It removes the need for constant adjustment, explanation, or concealment. When a person lives in alignment with what they know to be true, life no longer requires excessive defense. Actions match values, words match intent, memory matches reality. That internal agreement creates a steadiness that feels like peace. Manipulation works in the opposite direction. It fractures the inner world. It demands separation between what is thought, what is said, and what is done. Each separation creates tension. Each tension requires energy to manage. Over time, the mind becomes crowded with contradictions. Cannot live there because peace depends on coherence. Where coherence is absent, anxiety fills the gap. You witnessed this difference gradually, perhaps without fully naming it at first. When you chose integrity, especially when it cost you, you reduced internal noise. You no longer had to remember which version of yourself to present. You no longer had to justify what you felt or explain away what you saw. Even when life was painful, it was at least honest. That honesty allowed healing to begin, because healing requires truth as its foundation. Those who relied on manipulation experienced the opposite effect. Their lives required constant correction. Relationships demanded strategy instead of sincerity. Conversations required calculation. This constant management creates exhaustion. The mind never rests, because rest would invite truth, and truth would threaten the structure holding everything together. Chaos follows not as punishment, but as byproduct. Chaos does not always look like disaster. Often it appears as instability, plans that fall apart without clear reason, relationships that sour unexpectedly, a sense of unease that cannot be explained away. These are not coincidences. They are signs of internal disorder expressing itself externally. Life reflects what it is given. When it is given manipulation, it returns complexity. When it is given integrity, it returns clarity. You may have noticed how your own environment changed as you moved away from manipulation. Conversations became simpler. Boundaries became easier to hold. Decisions required less second-guessing. Even challenges felt cleaner because they were not entangled with deception. Peace did not arrive all at once, but it arrived consistently, reinforcing itself through small moments of relief and recognition. Manipulation, by contrast, multiplies problems. One lie requires another. One distortion invites further distortion. Each attempt to control outcomes narrows options. Over time, life becomes reactive rather than responsive. Everything feels urgent because nothing feels stable. This is the chaos that follows manipulation, not dramatic, but relentless. Peace does not shout its presence. It is recognized by what is absent: constant tension, defensiveness, and fear of exposure. It allows a person to sit with themselves without distraction. That capacity is rare, and it is earned through integrity, not circumstance. You earned it by choosing alignment when misalignment would have been easier. The contrast between peace and chaos grows sharper with time. Integrity compounds quietly. Manipulation compounds noisily. One simplifies life, the other complicates it. And life, in its own impartial way, continues to reflect the difference. You were never appointed as judge, executioner, or keeper of the scales. That role does not belong to individuals, no matter how deeply they have been wrong. Your task was never to enforce justice, because enforced justice binds the enforcer to the offense. It keeps attention locked on the harm, tethered to the very situation that must be outgrown. What was asked of you, though it may not have felt like a choice at the time, was something quieter and far more difficult: to choose truth and freedom without guarantees. Truth is costly because it removes comforting illusions. It requires acknowledging what happened without reshaping it to preserve connection or dignity. Freedom is costly because it demands separation from what cannot be redeemed. Both choices require relinquishing control over outcomes. You were asked to release the desire to be understood by those who benefited from misunderstanding you. That release felt like loss, but it was actually alignment with something larger than personal vindication. Justice pursued personally often becomes distorted by pain. Even when justified, it rarely heals. It seeks balance through retaliation, but retaliation extends the lifespan of harm. Freedom works differently. It withdraws energy from the cycle entirely. It refuses to participate further. This refusal is not passive, it is decisive. It redirects life away from conflict and toward coherence. You may have felt pressure, from within or from others, to demand acknowledgement, apology, or correction. Those demands are understandable, but they assume the other party is capable of meeting them honestly. When they are not, insistence only deepens frustration. Freedom does not wait for permission. It moves when clarity arrives. You chose movement over stagnation, even when movement felt uncertain. Choosing truth also meant accepting that some outcomes would unfold without your involvement. That acceptance is difficult because it feels like surrender. In reality, it is trust. Trust that reality is capable of responding without our interference. This trust does not deny pain. It refuses to let pain dictate purpose. It recognizes that some lessons must be learned without explanation, and some reckonings must occur without witnesses. Your role was to remain aligned with what you knew, even when that alignment isolated you. You were not required to prove anything. Proof-seeking keeps people entangled. Alignment frees them. By choosing truth, you ensured that your future would not be built on compromise. By choosing freedom, you ensured that your life would not revolve around correcting the past. Justice, when it arrives naturally, is precise. It does not need advocacy. It does not require orchestration. It emerges as correspondence between behavior and experience. By stepping aside, you allowed that correspondence to occur without distortion. You did not abandon justice, you entrusted it to something impartial. This choice reshaped you. It taught discernment instead of defensiveness. It replaced urgency with patience. It shifted focus from outcome to integrity. And integrity, once chosen, becomes a compass. It guides decisions quietly, consistently, without demanding validation. You were never meant to carry the burden of setting things right for others. You were meant to set yourself right. Everything else follows its own order. The discomfort they feel now is not a punishment imposed from outside. It is recognition arriving from within. There is a profound difference between being hurt by circumstances and being unsettled by self-awareness. The first can be blamed, escaped, or numbed. The second cannot. Self-recognition follows a person into silence, into sleep, into moments where distraction fails. It does not accuse loudly. It simply presents facts without commentary. And that quiet presentation is often more disturbing than any external consequence. For a long time, it is possible to move through life insulated by explanation. Words can be arranged to soften responsibility. Narratives can be edited to preserve pride, but recognition bypasses language. It emerges when the mind begins to connect patterns that were once kept separate. It happens when memory aligns with outcome and excuses lose their hold. The unease that follows is not cruelty, it is clarity pressing against resistance. This is why the discomfort feels so persistent. It is not rooted in fear of exposure, but in awareness of discrepancy. Who they believed themselves to be no longer matches what experience reflects back. That mismatch creates tension that cannot be resolved by denial alone. Something must give, either the image or the understanding. Until one yields, discomfort remains. Recognition often begins with small moments, a familiar conflict repeating itself, a relationship failing in the same way, a quiet thought that surfaces unexpectedly. At first, these moments are dismissed, then they accumulate. The mind grows tired of defending contradictions. Justifications begin to sound hollow, even to the one repeating them. This is when discomfort deepens, because the distance between belief and reality narrows. Unlike punishment, recognition does not demand self-loathing. It demands honesty. It asks for a willingness to see, without distortion. Many resist this request because it threatens identity. Admitting harm requires relinquishing a version of oneself built on being right, being wronged, or being misunderstood. That relinquishment feels like loss, and yet it is the only path toward coherence. The discomfort is also intensified by memory. Moments once dismissed return with new meaning. Words spoken casually now carry weight. Choices once justified now appear unnecessary. This recontextualization is unsettling because it rewrites the past without changing it. The events remain the same, but their interpretation shifts. What once felt neutral now feels heavy. That weight is recognition taking root. There is also a loneliness to this stage. Recognition cannot be delegated. No one else can do it for you. Apologies, if offered, may soothe conscience but do not dissolve awareness. Understanding requires sitting with what is seen long enough for it to settle. This sitting is uncomfortable because it strips away distraction and demands presence. Many attempt to flee it through activity, noise, or blame. But recognition follows. It waits. What makes this discomfort transformative, when it is allowed to be, is that it clarifies choice. Once a person sees themselves accurately, they must decide whether to change or to harden. The discomfort is the threshold. It is not meant to destroy, but to instruct. Whether the instruction is received depends on willingness to endure the unease without numbing it. You are not responsible for this discomfort. You did not create it, provoke it, or design it. It arose because recognition does what it always does when avoidance runs out. It tells the truth quietly and waits to see what will be done with it. Their greatest realization does not arrive with drama or confession. It arrives as a quiet understanding that access has been lost, and that what was lost cannot be replaced. This realization is subtle at first, almost imperceptible. It surfaces in comparisons that feel unfair, in moments where something feels missing but cannot be named. Over time, it sharpens into clarity. What they dismissed was not expendable. What they mishandled was not ordinary, and what they lost cannot be recovered through effort alone. Access is an underestimated gift. It is easy to assume that presence is permanent, that patience is endless, that forgiveness will always be available on demand. This assumption breeds carelessness. When access feels guaranteed, respect becomes optional. Boundaries are tested. Kindness is taken for granted. It is only after access is withdrawn that its value becomes undeniable. What they lost was not simply you as a person, but the role you played in their lives, often without recognition. You provided stability without control, honesty without manipulation, presence without agenda. These qualities are rare, but they are most invisible to those who benefit from them. Their absence reveals what presence concealed. This realization often arrives too late because it requires contrast. While you were there, your steadiness normalized what should have been cherished. Only after distance sets in does comparison become possible. New connections lack depth. Interactions feel transactional. Trust requires effort where it once flowed naturally. These differences highlight what was unique about what they lost.